Run it up.
Cinematic, the visual qualities or aesthetics of a film or video. See, the word cinematic, I feel like it's being overused way too much within this space. And yes, I always chase the cinematic look, but if you actually don't know what you're chasing, how do you know what looks good and what doesn't? And to be honest, every time I go to a new location, I get to a new place, I always try and focus on so many things before I actually start shooting. I look at lighting, composition, I imagine what it would look like after I edit it, after I add my color grading, after I add my little effects in post. So there is so many things that you have to know and you have to remember when you want to create this holy cinematic look. And it doesn't matter if you're shooting someone making a coffee, or it doesn't matter if you're shooting an epic cliff in Portugal. So you just gotta remember a few things. And this is what we're covering today in today's video. So we're gonna divide this video into different categories, and these categories are lighting, because pretty much when shooting video and taking photos, all we do is take light and shape light to make things look good. But you gotta know what looks good and what doesn't, and how to shoot the best way. The second category we're covering is composition, because you really shouldn't just turn up to a location and point your camera at something and hoping it's gonna look good. Usually I like to take 5 to 10 minutes and just try and make my composition a bit more interesting than just pointing my camera at the subject and hoping he will look good. The third we're covering is aperture, because I still make this mistake. When I look at the lens, I just look what is the most wide open aperture it has, what's the widest it can go, 2.8, 1.8, 1.4. I recently got a Cine lens that can do T1.4, which is pretty much f1, which is super shallow, but that's actually wrong. You shouldn't always shoot at 2.8 or 1.4 wide open. You should also remember to shoot, maybe 5 or 5.6 or 6, because especially when shooting subject, you don't want half of their faces out of focus. That's just not a good look. The last one is colors and post-production, because you can take amazing footage, but if you don't know how to color grade and what looks good in post-production, then you might as well give it to a colorist. Some of the effects that I actually really enjoy using is vignette. I think it's very important to understand how to use vignette to focus of the shot to whatever you want it to focus onto your subject, for example. How subtle has to be a vignette, but also something like adding blur, tiny bit of blur to the corners is something I learned recently. And since I've started doing it, I feel like everything just looks better. So I like to share all of this with you. Let's start right away with lighting. This is huge, possibly the most important thing you gotta learn when talking about filmmaking and cinematography. It's lighting. And I personally like to shoot 99% of my work using natural light, which means I always try and use the sun, use golden hour, use sunrise, sunsets, blue hours, dusk dawns, all of it to create different moods within my videos. And the thing that I mostly love to do, that I read actually maybe like a year or 2 years ago, is that you just gotta shoot shadow side 99% of the times. Shooting shadow side, it is the main rule when it comes to lighting and cinematography, because it is just what looks good. If my camera is there, my light is here, for a talking sequence like this, it's perfect, because you want to this is not supposed to be cinematic, it's just supposed to look good. But technically, if I just move like this, and I would put the light here and the camera there, it would create such a more three-dimensional look. On this side of my face, it would be super dark, and this side of my face would be a lot brighter, creating a lot more of a 3D effect. So whenever I shoot anything, I always think, what is shadow side? Where is my light coming from? How do I create an interesting look? And shooting shadow side doesn't mean that you have to always put the subject exactly in between of the light and the camera. No, it just means that you don't have to pass that 45-degree angle. So the light could be anywhere there and the camera there, and it's still kind of shadow side, because it creates this 3D effect on the face and on the subject. So next time you go out and shoot, definitely test these out. Definitely remember, where's my subject? Where is the light coming from? Which way is better to shoot from? And sometime maybe you're shooting outside and the light is coming from all directions. So you just gotta kind of try and shape it so that it looks better. Pretty much, that's what I do. Composition is also incredibly important when talking about filmmaking, because take this shot for example, right? I could have placed myself in so many different ways. I could have put the camera over there and have more of a leading lines angle behind me. I could have put this light in a different way so that my face would be exposed in a different way, and I could have had no light in the background, for example. But I decided to place myself here because I think the background with these lines coming all towards the subject, which is me, and this light right here in the background just makes everything looks very geometric and very pleasant to the eye. So it's very important that whenever you shoot anything, you understand what is around you and how can you make something that makes sense. And composition is actually incredible. And once you understand the rule of third, how to place the subject in the right way, it's actually one of the things that I love to watch in movies. Whenever I watch films or whatever I watch, I always try and take notes, and just like in my head, I'm like, okay, they place the subject there. Why did they place it there? Why didn't they place it there? Why is the light coming from this way? Why is this in focus? Why is this not on focus? So a very interesting exercise that I do sometimes when I want to understand a bit more. It's use one of these websites that you can find stills from movies, and just going through it, maybe find a movie you like and just go through a few stills and then understand why they placed the subject where they placed it, and try and recreate a similar scene in your next film, for example. For example, when I try to script for a video that I want to shoot, whatever it's a film, a commercial, a client, a non-client, passion, whatever it is, I always try and take stills from films for examples and try and keep those in mind when I'm shooting, so that I can recreate a very similar composition, because clearly that composition was right and worked. And by doing this, try error, you slowly learn, and then it will just come up natural. So this is my favorite exercise to practice composition, and you should do it too. On to number 3, which is don't shoot wide open. Aperture leads to very different types of shots. If you shoot at 2.8 or if you shoot at f/22, it's very different, obviously. And 90% of the time, to be honest, I have my camera set at 2.8, because this specific lens, the Sigma 2470, shoots wide open at 2.8, and it's a beautiful look. But sometimes I actually make mistakes because I forget to change my aperture because I am in a rush. But if I'm not in a rush, I always try to remember, what kind of shot do I want? Do I need the subject to be that out of focus? Do I need the subject to be that in focus? How much background separation do I need? Do I need a sharp image? Do I need a non so sharp image? Because as we all know, in filmmaking, we don't really chase the sharpest image all the time like in photography. So, if I want a very sharp image, if I'm shooting a portrait of someone and I want everything to be in focus and everything to be super sharp, and I'm shooting very up close maybe, then I'm going to shoot between f4 to f5.6, because this is what the sharpest aperture of this specific lens is. And most lenses are actually the sharpest f4. So if you're shooting someone up close, I always recommend shooting between f4 to f5.6, just to make sure you don't get that weird, the eyes on focus and then their nose out of focus, and it just looks a bit awkward. It doesn't look that nice. So you always got to ask yourself what kind of shot you're looking for and what do you want to show, because the bokeh between f4 and f2.8, honestly, it's not gonna change that much. And the only reason you should shoot wide open is if you're shooting in low light, because if you don't have much light, the more you open your lens, the more light goes into your sensor. We have finally made it to the most subjective part of this video, which is color. Color is extremely subjective, and the proof of this, it's movies like Matrix that have the most weirdest color palette there is, to be honest. but it still looks cinematic, it still looks good, people still like it, which is a perfect proof that it doesn't matter what color you should use. You should never just use teal and orange all the time. You should go for exactly what you like. And what I like, for example, it's a very natural looking color with a bit of blue, a bit of green in the shadows, and just warm highlights. And then I like to add halation, I like to add blur in my corner, I like to add vignette. And vignette, I think, is the most important things of color grading sometimes, because you can shape the light of your scene, you can enhance darkness in different part of your image. Like if you want anything to be more highlighted, more enhanced in your image, you can add a mask with a vignette on one side of the image rather than on the other one, or all around, or on the bottom or on the top. Just use vignette and darken your image in different sides to enhance what you want them to look at. Halation, I just like to add halation because it just looks a bit more filmic, which is what I like to chase. And blur, I use a tiny bit of blur. You probably won't even notice, but in all four corners I add motion blur because you just get this weird old lens look, and you're honestly not even gonna see it. But in movies like The Batman, if you look at the stills of that movie, every single corner is slightly blurred out, and that is not a post-production, that is just the lens they chose to shoot on give that very cool weird effect. And one example of this lens is the Helios 44-2, which was actually used in The Batman. And this lens is famous for the swirly bokeh, but also for having extremely blurry corners. And it's just a very interesting look. And I like to add this in post-production rather than in lens because I don't have a $10,000 lens yet. Colors and effects are very, very subjective, as I said before. So play with it and just find your own style, and don't get restricted by what people say looks good, what doesn't. Just find your own styles. That's it for this one, guys. See you guys in the next video.